They called me the one who quit, the one who drifted, the one who couldn't handle it, whatever it was. At family gatherings, they talked around me. Christmas cards listed every grandchild's name, including my cousin's baby, who hadn't even been born yet, but not mine. At my niece's graduation, they had custom programs with photos, bios, little fun facts. My name wasn't on the list, not even as a guest. I stood in the back. My chair was taken. No one noticed. The truth, I never stopped working. I just disappeared because that was the only way to stay alive. They thought I gave up, but the only thing I gave up was needing their approval. When the groom's father, a silver-haired man in a simple black suit, took the mic during the reception, I didn't think much of it. He smiled politely, scanning the room. Then his eyes landed on table 12. On me. He paused, squinted, took a second look. "Is that General Quinn?" he said half to himself, as if testing his memory out loud. No one else knew what was happening, but I did. And in a few seconds, so would everyone else. He turned to face me, fully straightened his posture, and said aloud, "General Quinn." "Ma'am." Then he raised his hand and delivered a formal military salute. A fork clattered onto someone's plate. My sister froze mid-step. My mother dropped her napkin. And just that once, no one called me the one who gave up. My name is Maya Quinn. I'm 48 years old. I've spent nearly 3 decades in the military, most of it behind classified walls, in places people only talk about in hypotheticals. I've led missions under fire, coordinated evacuations under blackout, and stayed awake through nights when the safest place to be was still nowhere near safe. I've been a soldier, a strategist, and now a major general in the United States Army. To my country, I'm someone they call when everything else has failed. But to my family, I've always been something else entirely. A cautionary tale, a quiet shame, someone to seat near the kitchen, so the real guests don't have to make small talk. That's why when I showed up at my sister's wedding, people didn't recognize me. Not because I looked different, but because they'd spent years training themselves not to look at me at all. At my father's funeral, my mother asked me not to wear my uniform. "This day is about him," she said, as if what I wore could hijack the moment. I showed up in a plain black dress. People assumed I was from the catering staff. My mother told the neighbours I worked in admin somewhere. A desk job. Something quiet, she liked to say, like it was a virtue. The kind of work that didn't make people uncomfortable. I never corrected her. I figured if the truth made her uneasy, maybe silence was kinder. But I never stopped working. I didn't burn out. I didn't fall apart. I didn't run. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't seen. That's the part no one understood. So when my sister's wedding came around, I didn't expect an invitation. I just got a letter from my mother. No stamp, no formal card, just a folded note stuffed into a grocery store envelope. She wrote in her usual rushed handwriting, "Eleanor's wedding is next Saturday. Please don't cause trouble." That was it. No sign I was her daughter. She didn't even use my name. But I wasn't going to let them erase me from this day. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I didn't wear my uniform, just a navy blouse and slacks, my hair pulled back, shoes, polished but not flashy. I arrived 10 minutes before the ceremony, parked a few blocks away, and walked in alone. No one noticed. A cousin walked past me in the hallway. A woman I didn't know smiled at me, a smile that stopped before it reached her eyes. Inside, the air was filled with soft laughter and champagne. Every chair had a name card except mine. The coordinator looked at my name like it didn't belong. She checked the seating chart. I saw her hesitate, flip a page scan again. "Oh, okay. Table 12, she finally said, pointing toward the far corner of the room. Table 12 wasn't on the main floor plan. It sat by the double doors where servers came in and out a few feet from the kitchen. The chairs didn't match. My place card was handwritten and crooked. The people at the table didn't share my last name or any last name I recognized. One of them had a cough that wouldn't stop. I poured myself a glass of water and looked around the room. Linen napkins folded into swans, string lights strung across beams like curated joy. My mother stood near the bar, smiling at guests like nothing in her life had ever gone sideways. Eleanor floated through in white lace radiant and scented like the world finally got its axis right. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I just watched steady and quiet like I'd learned to do in places where silence kept people alive. Sometimes people ask why I went. Why put myself through that? But the answer's simple. I went because no one gets to erase me. Not from a wedding, not from a room, not from my own life. I've stood in open deserts while rockets lit the night sky. I've slept on concrete with a rifle beside me, unsure if I'd wake up. I've held dying men's hands and told them we were going to make it, even when we both knew it wasn't true. If I could survive those moments, I could survive linen napkins and forced smiles. I didn't come to make a point. I didn't need closure. I came to sit in a chair and remind myself I still exist, even when no one's looking, even when they wish I wouldn't. There was something almost comical about it, how hard they worked to pretend I wasn't there. The photographer skipped our table during the dinner shots. The slideshow that played behind the head table featured baby pictures of Elena and grainy videos of family vacations, but none with me in them. When someone dropped a fork near my chair, they said, "Sorry, miss," like I was hotel staff. I didn't correct them. I just sat back, folded my hands and watched. When the salad course came, someone at the table glanced at me and asked, "So, are you with the venue?" I shook my head. "Family," I said. He didn't ask how. The music played, glasses clinked. Elena and her new husband did their first dance. My mother dabbed her eyes like it was the royal wedding. My name never came up. But even then, even in that exact moment, I knew I didn't need them to see me. I just needed to remember that I wasn't invisible. They thought I showed up because I had nowhere better to be. The truth was, I had somewhere far better, but I chose to be here. Because I don't let shame write my story. Not anymore. And that table, that little forgotten corner of the hall, that was where everything changed. But not right away. First came the silence. Then the noise, the kind you hear without being part of it. The hum of polite conversation. The clink of forks against salad plates. The soft laughter that never reached the corners of the room, let alone my table. At table 12, people spoke in hushed tones, mostly to each other. Occasionally, a glance would land on me and slide away like I was a misprint in the guest list. I folded my hands in my lap, listened to the murmurs, and let my eyes wander. That's when I started noticing the pattern, the choreography of dismissal. I saw my aunt, who used to bring me peppermint gum when I was 7, look straight through me as she hugged my cousin. I saw my uncle whisper something into his wife's ear, both of them stealing a glance my way before adjusting their posture like they'd just remembered to behave. My name was never said out loud, but my presence created tiny ripples, like a ghost brushing against linen. A man in a beige jacket came over from another table. I didn't know his name, but he had the Quinn jawline square, and slightly defiant, so I assumed he was family. He smiled half-heartedly. "You're Michelle, right from Ohio?" I shook my head. "Maya," I said, from nowhere in particular. He laughed, the kind people do when they realize they've made a mistake and can't find the exit. Right. Sorry." He drifted away before I could ask who he thought I was. Later, someone asked, "You still working with, the military? Or did you leave all that behind?" It wasn't cruel, just careless. Like asking if someone's still single at a wedding. I didn't answer, just smiled. It was easier that way. I didn't want their curiosity. I didn't want to explain what I did, or where I'd been, or why I still carried sand in the soles of my boots even when I wore flats. I wasn't there to impress anyone. I wasn't there to be forgiven. I was there to sit, to witness, to remind myself that I could still be in a room where I was unwanted and stay standing, or in this case, seated. There was a moment during dinner when the background noise grew louder. People passed around toasts, short speeches filled with inside jokes and references to memories I wasn't part of. My name again didn't come up. A slideshow played in the background, Eleanor in her prom dress, Eleanor at graduation, Eleanor and her fiancé on some beach that looked expensive. I wasn't in any frame, not even accidentally. It was curated absence. At one point, someone tapped my shoulder gently. I turned. It was a woman about my age, maybe a friend of the groom. She tilted her head, gave me a polite smile. I don't mean to be rude, but are you with the venue? You just look very composed. I wanted to laugh. I almost did. Family, I said. She blinked. Oh, that was the end of it. The photographer moved from table to table, snapping group shots, laughter, candid cheers. He skipped ours. Didn't even glance our way. I don't think it was intentional. I think he was told which tables mattered. Table 12 wasn't on that list. There was a brief pause in the music while they changed tracks and I looked around. People clinked glasses, leaned into conversations, dabbed at the corners of their eyes, like they were watching something deeply moving. None of it touched me. And I didn't need it to. If you've ever walked into a room and felt like a hologram, seen but not, acknowledged, present but not included, you understand what I mean. It wasn't the first time I felt it, but it was one of the most defined. The walls didn't keep me out, the people did, with their diverted eyes and absent words and rehearsed distractions. That's what made it a system. The exclusion wasn't personal, it was architectural. By the time the dessert came out, I'd memorized the rhythm. Someone would glance at me, maybe wonder if they should say something, then choose not to. A beat would pass. Then they'd turn to someone else and the conversation would restart like I'd never existed. I think I preferred that to the awkward misnaming. At least invisibility was consistent. I thought about my last deployment, how we used to joke that the only time you knew someone cared about you was when they asked if you were still alive at breakfast. That was our standard of affection. Brutal, but honest. Here at this wedding, surrounded by people who shared my blood and my childhood, the silence felt colder. Not because it was mean, but because it was practiced. They had perfected the art of ignoring me. A little boy wandered over from another table. He had chocolate on his fingers and a bow tie askew. "Are you a spy?" he asked. His mum gasped and called him back, mouthing apologies over his shoulder. I smiled. "Only sometimes," I said. He giggled and ran off. He was the only person who looked me in the eye all night. The background noise continued. Forks scraped plates, chairs shifted. Eleanor laughed loudly from across the room, a perfect bride in perfect light. My mother stood beside her beaming. From my seat at table 12, I saw it all. And in the stillness of that moment, surrounded by the hum of a party I wasn't meant to belong to, I made myself a quiet promise. This would be the last time they got to write me out of the picture. Memories came flooding back, scenes of me on the outer edges of every family photo. I saw my younger self standing by the doorway in the background, the edge of my face barely in the frame. There was that Christmas picture, the one Mum hung every year in the living room, my sister's smiling face at centre. Every cousin around her and me cropped out. Literally. Someone had taken scissors to my image before framing it. I can still feel the acid bite of shame when I first noticed the misshapen photo. How it felt like being erased in broad daylight. My father's funeral is another memory seared into my mind. I'd served in uniform, paid my respects like any daughter would. But Mom pulled me aside before the ceremony and asked me not to wear it. "This day is about him," she said, as though my service was a distraction. I swapped my uniform for a plain black dress and wondered if choosing between duty to country and duty to family really had to be a choice at all. Those moments weren't just hurt, they were laying bricks in the wall of doubt I built around my own sense of belonging. And then, when I finally found a place that felt like home in the military, Elena cast the first stone. It was my second year at the academy. I'd been doing well enough excelling in drills and finishing top of my class in logistics training. I brought home copies of the handbook SOP's commendation notes, proof I belonged. But a few weeks before the mandatory physical and academic review, Elena showed up at my dorm. She knocked breezed inside without waiting and handed me a container of homemade cookies and a bottle of detox juice. "Thought you might like a treat before the big test," she said, her smile warm. I thanked her, took the juice, tucked it in the mini fridge. I didn't think much of it, she was my sister. We'd never been close, but she was there. Next morning, I passed the drill. The written test went in for the medical screening. 2 days later, I got called into the command office. I remember the way the cold, fluorescent light pooled on the desk, how the colonel cleared his throat before sliding a sheet across the table. It was a positive result modafinil, a stimulant banned in our protocol. I stared at that report like it was a lie printed in red ink. There was no bottle in my room, no trail of pills, nothing. I asked for a retest, swore I'd never touched any illicit substance. They launched an internal investigation. They pulled my academic records, my background info. Someone had submitted an anonymous complaint using the Academy's complaint portal. They accused me of forging my degree background qualifications. At 30, I'd earned my degree honestly, but the suggestion alone threatened to derail everything. They questioned me for weeks. Hallway whispers followed me back to my bunk. I'd be walking across campus and hear footsteps fall silent behind me. Security checks practically became daily. I felt surveillance in every glance, every quiet judgment. During an all-hands check-in, I overheard Eleanor mention that detox juice at a staff party. "Remember that mint juice you made her drink?" She laughed. "She turned green for hours." Someone snickered. My heart dropped into my stomach. That juice, the only unusual thing I had ingested before the test. Later, after a battery of follow-up screening hair samples, tested for cumulative substance use, advanced medical analysis, they concluded no modafinil. What showed positive was a rare herb compound that can cause false positives. They traced it back to certain detox blends. Conclusion. I was innocent. My degree was verified by multiple schools. The complaint line traced to an internal IP address on base. I found out much later that it had come from my sister's room. She had read my academy materials, knew enough to game the system. My suspension was lifted. My name cleared. But by the time I walked out of that office, everything had changed. I lost my place in my unit, missed promotion cycles, lost trust. No one apologized. My sister never mentioned it. My family didn't ask if I was okay. They only heard rumors that I'd been kicked out or dropped from the program, and they never bothered to correct it. By the time I rejoined, I was assigned to a rear logistics unit, critical but far from the spotlight. I stopped expecting invitations. I stopped hoping for calls. But I kept going. Each mission, each deployment, each long night planning supply chains in war zones. I rebuilt my sense of self from the dust of that betrayal. Now sitting at this corner table at my sister's wedding, I realize how those early days shaped everything. That failure and the quiet war that followed became a foundation. It forced me to stop hiding. It forced me to keep climbing, to prove not to them, but to myself that I belonged. I don't carry their ignorance anymore, but neither have I forgotten it. The day after that weird toast, I found myself seated in my commanding officer's office. He didn't look at me when I entered, just motioned to a chair across from a polished wood desk. "Maya, your test came back positive for modafinil," he said flatly, "and we've received an anonymous report suggesting you used a falsified degree to enlist." The words didn't land like a punch. They felt distant, like the static before a broadcast. But I understood the weight behind them. Modafinil is banned. A phony degree career ender. I want to cooperate fully, I managed to say, voice as steady as I could force it. They suspended me on the spot. My training unit, my mission, everything halted. One call to my family. Mum, I've been suspended pending an investigation. Nothing. No questions, no concern, no message saying, we love you. That silence felt heavier than any charge. For weeks, I was confined to base, moved from one office to another. They took my uniform, my badge, even my service pistol. They asked for every transcript and certificate I'd earned from West Point to the logistics school in Georgia, all the way to my advanced strategics training. I sent every document, every email confirmation, every pay stub and assignment order. Still, they kept me in limbo. Meanwhile, the lab conducted follow-up tests, hair samples, blood panels, even muscle tissue from a harmless biopsy. Specialists looked for long-term traces of modafinil. Their conclusion, no sustained use. Only the one spike from that initial test. The official report suggested contamination via herbal compounds, like the kind in detox drinks. Unusual case, the military doctor said, but plausible. Then came verification of my academic records. The governor of my alma mater confirmed with archives and yearbooks. The commandant at the War College personally vouched for my attendance. That final signature, my degree was real earned in late-night study groups, field exercises and sweat-soaked drills. 3 months passed. My world shrank to the dull walls of interrogation rooms and waiting areas. I tracked every email, every phone call sent to my schools, every inquiry my officers made. When word finally came, I'd been cleared. I'd spent those months on my knees, learning patience like I'd learned discipline under fire. They offered me reinstatement, but not in my old role. For unit cohesion, they said I would go to a rear echelon logistics team in Kansas. Far from the forward deployed units I'd fought with. It wasn't a demotion formally, but it was. I knew it, and they knew it. That silence back home didn't shift. At Thanksgiving, a picture of me in uniform under a tree, captioned "Missing at Christmas," circulated anonymously. No one said anything, but every like felt like a cold shoulder. I learned to let that slide too. Inside me, a storm roared. Questions that had no answers. Who would do that? Who would read my files, track my interviews, plant herbal powder in my drink? But even with that suspicion, I didn't suspect anyone. Not yet. It was easier not to know, easier not to accuse. My family never asked for details. Not one word. Not when I was cleared, not when I left that unit behind. That left a void I filled with work. I volunteered to oversee supply convoys, then humanitarian missions into flood zones. I buried myself in operations coordinating medevac airlifts, training Afghan liaison officers, restructuring battalion logistics after base attacks. Slowly, I rebuilt my reputation from the grit up. But every progress was tinged with the memory of what they'd almost done to me. I pointedly never spoke of it. Not to new teammates, not to my superiors. It was a scar, a lesson, a reminder. Trust outcomes, not assumptions. When I got the news I was being recommended for Major General, my first real promotion, since the accusation I didn't celebrate. Not then. I watched the insignia pins weighing down my chest and thought I earned this without a word. Silent redemption earned in the field. Yet I felt its absence, the absence of a family question. A card that said, "We're proud of you," a phone call, a text, something. But none came. So I learned to hear pride in my own echo. The investigation had stopped them from pushing me out, but it didn't stop them from leaving me in the shadows. That was my reality cleared, promoted still unseen by the people who mattered most, my own kin. I kept moving forward. I found purpose in missions, in mentoring young soldiers, in planning large-scale operations. And that purpose grew louder than their silence. But I never forgot it. I've laid this groundwork because what happens next won't surprise you. In a room full of polite dinner chatter, I'll stand at a table misnamed and misremembered. I'll sit across a pitcher of water I poured myself. And I'll wait. Because now, at this wedding reception here, at the edge of a room that isn't mine, my promotion is genuine, but so is my promise. To show up, to remain, to occupy space I earned, to write myself back into the story. What's next is where everything changes again. The room shimmered with laughter and soft conversation. Men in tailored suits, women in flowing dresses, everyone dressed for celebration. I stood in the corner near my place, and for just a moment, I felt like a server, not a guest. It wasn't intentional, but that's how I was treated. A woman with a DSLR and a clipboard approached my table. "Excuse me, could you help me take a group photo?" she asked. No warm smile. She handed me her camera like a tray and pointed to her friends. I pressed the button framed them, and they murmured, "Thank you," with no recognition. I set the camera down, picked up my glass of water, and took a measured sip. I stayed calm. I didn't acknowledge the slight. I let it hover. Judith, one of my cousin's wives, I barely knew, paused near me with a knowing shake of her head. "Well," she said loud enough for me to hear, "looks like she retired early. Must be the early exit they say it takes its toll." She smirked as if she delivered a punchline. Not even a glance. My uniform was off, but they treated me like someone far past her shelf life. I didn't respond. I just swirled the water in my glass until it cleared. It was strangely soothing, the familiarity of constant motion forced unseen. I wasn't going to correct her or challenge any assumptions. I let her thoughts remain her own. Silence has its own weight, and in that weight, I found quiet clarity. Around me, the hubbub continued the way it always does. I watched as people leaned in for whispers, shared inside jokes, and posed in front of photo backdrops. I observed the patterns, how they turned away when I passed, how chairs were almost pushed aside, how the bartender took 5 seconds too long to pour me a drink. These weren't accidental slights, they were rehearsed moves in the choreography of exclusion. Still, I was there, under harsher lighting in louder spaces, with everyone comfortably misplacing me in their minds. They treated me like a veteran cast off visible, but invisible. A reserve asset they didn't know what to do with. So they sidestepped and glossed over. Nothing about their behaviour surprised me. I'd practiced standing still beneath heavier storms. So I tolerated it, not because I was agreeable, but because every moment I stayed was a moment they lost control over my story. I studied the room as though I'd mapped it before. Rows of tables, floral centerpieces, the small stage where speeches would happen later. Their chatter buzzed around me, but I held to an internal frequency that didn't waver. It wasn't dignity I held on to, it was a quiet declaration. I'm here. I earned this seat. Their outward indifference meant nothing. Inside me I pulsed with purpose, tempered by years of discipline and silence. Every unfair glance and mistaken assumption chipped away their illusions of who I was. "Can I get you anything?" the bartender asked. I didn't need another drink, but I nodded, thinking a cold water would help. He poured, slid it to me, and seemed unsure whether to wait for payment. I gave him a small grateful nod and left it at that. I felt the oddness of the moment, sipping water, dressed neatly, holding a place in a room full of names and titles I couldn't claim. But I claimed it anyway. No apology, no fuss. I let it stand. Someone asked about my job. A man at the table next to me turned to ask casually, "Are you still in the service?" I nodded. "Yes." Then he paused. "It's impressive." He nodded again, uncertain. Then walked away like he'd just survived an uncomfortable truth. That tiny acknowledgement cut through the formal shields. It was nothing and yet everything. It was the first, microscopic peel of their assumptions. I didn't smile. I didn't say thanks. I just looked at him until he realized I was waiting, and he found his chair again. In that microsecond, I decided I would not let them define my visibility by their comfort levels. I'd take up space. I'd honour every absurd slight, because to survive desert dust and enemy fire and accusations and isolation and bureaucracy, I'd gone through far worse than whispers at a wedding. I straightened my back, finished my water, and set the glass down softly. I picked up my napkin, dabbed at my fingers, and began to stand. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I belonged here. My service had bought me the right to exist in every space I chose, even ones that weren't built for me. I turned toward the stage, ready to receive whatever came next. Speeches, toasts, applause, or silence. Whatever they offered, I was done shrinking. This celebration wasn't mine, but my presence there was its own quiet victory. I stood ready. I spotted Elena across the room. Her white dress caught the light, haloed by filigrees of lace. She paused mid-laugh, then took a step toward me. Our eyes met, and for a second I saw something in her expression that wasn't surprise, just a practiced neutrality. Vui vici, Jen, she said, that familiar lilt of hers, soft, controlled, like she always meant to be polite. Du ko the hoi batango. I nodded once measured. I thought I belonged. She offered a small smile, head tilted. Of course. You thought. Those words were bland, but they carried the weight of everything unspoken my career, the scandal, the distance. She didn't ask, are you still in the military? She didn't ask about Afghanistan or what I'd done since they last saw me. Nothing. Silence filled in those blanks. A cousin of ours hovered nearby, half smiling. As Elena stepped away, leaning in to greet a group, the cousin's voice drifted to me. She probably has, PTSD, from being overseas. Her tone was tentative, like she hadn't thought it through. I took a slow breath, then nodded politely, as if confirming a rumour she was too polite to state outright. PTSD. It rolled around in my mind, a label for people who weren't me, but now in their minds I had become that. Someone fragile, damaged, too broken to talk about, too broken to include. I held my expression quiet, unblinking. If she thought, that let her. But I pressed deeper into my resolve. No correction, no retort, no exposure. I let the label hang in the air. Around us, laughter bubbled back. Glasses clinked. Someone tapped on their phone. Elena drifted into another conversation, her posture relaxed, unguarded. I realised then she'd practiced this too, the distancing, the assumptions, the mask of being supportive without actually delving into truth. That's the moment I understood the damage had been done long ago, well before today. She distanced herself from me when I was young, hungry for approval. Now she did it through stillness. I turned back to the room. The band started playing something slow and melodic. I didn't feel the urge to stay or go, just a calm acceptance of where I was and what I'd overcome. A waiter passed by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. I selected a cheese cube and olive as if I belonged to that moment. I chewed slowly, watching my family from the corner of my eye. Eleanor toggled between conversations, unaware of how tightly I held on to my composure. Chatting started to weave through the room again. I could hear half snippets of gossip. She left so suddenly, guess she joined a humanitarian mission. I heard she teaches now. None of it true, none of it accurate, but nearly all of it better than PTSD. I swallowed hard. That bite of food grounded me. I wasn't defined by their stories. I knew what I'd done. I knew where I'd been. At that moment, I realised I didn't need them to confront her. I didn't need an apology. I didn't even need acknowledgement. I just needed to know I was still here, whole, capable, unshaken. I needed that for me. A distant bell chimed, signalling the next course. The murmur of forks and plates being set down drifted in. Above it all, orchestral strings swelled as they prepared to play a wedding piece. I straightened my shoulders. I set the cheese plate on the side table. My mind flicked forward what would come next. Would my story remain locked in that corner of assumptions, or would something more change? I took one last glance at Elena. She looked radiant, happy, confident. I nodded once, like a silent acknowledgement. She caught it. Our eyes met for a heartbeat longer this time. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. There was no apology, but I didn't need one. I walked away from the table, stepping into the path of the band. Whatever happened next, I was ready for what comes after silence. I drifted closer, almost on autopilot, until I caught sight of Elena chatting with a few cousins near the bar. She laughed, lifted a bottled water from a nearby stand, and took a sip before turning to her guests. That's when she spoke loud enough I could hear, and under the murmur of music, her voice was like a caught breath. "Hey, remember that mint detox water I gave you before your medical check? I must have gone overboard. You turned so pale I thought you were going to pass out." She smiled, but only with her mouth. Her eyes never met mine. My body tightened. That water before my first test was the only thing out of place that day. Somehow it set off the lab results. I remembered the sterile lab room, cold and bright, the officer standing over me, frowning at the test printout. I sat frozen while they repeated the process. Only later did I learn that particular blend of herbs had caused a false positive for modafinil. But I didn't know any of that in the moment. All I felt was suspicion and a looming sense of betrayal. The room spun as patchwork memories rushed in. The note I found on my bunk negative drug screen. Suspected fake degree. Investigation in progress. A knock on the barracks door before dawn, 2 officers in uniforms I barely recognised telling me to gather my things. "You're suspended. Remove your insignia." The white envelope in my hand with the formal memo, the date the cryptic reference to further action as warranted. I remember the quiet drive to base, command the sterile halls where I waited. Even in my dress uniform, I wasn't told what I'd done wrong, just that I had been accused. And then the stares. The murmurs among my unit that I had been thrown out. The textbooks I retrieved from my locker, everything abruptly returned except my dignity. I was reassigned to a support squad overseas, one far from the command path under a colonel who treated me politely, but never with trust. I watched my name slide off promotional lists. Awards disappeared from my record. I was sidelined, a whisper of a soldier. But despite all that, I never stopped doing the work. I learned more that year than any before. I took every task, routine, or one-off and gave myself to it. I learned supply chains in austere environments, managed micro-diplomacy with local leaders, fixed broken communications gear at midnight. I logged endless nights and early morning briefings. I deferred, pay-skipped leave, kept going, and no one knew I was still there. Or they chose not to. So when Eleanor brought up that mint detox moment, I felt the pieces snap into place. She had known exactly how to trigger the test. She'd read that medical protocol soaked in old pamphlets or hidden PDFs on my laptop, then used my trust to set me up. And no one ever connected the dots. Not my commander, not my family, no one but me. I stayed where I was letting her tone slide over me, collecting the information silently. Did she think I'd spill my drink? Say something? Break character? I watched her guests nodding at her story, like it was harmless, like it was cute. But I knew what it meant. I knew what it had cost me. And for the first time that night, I felt something else calm. I met her eyes for a moment and didn't look away. She blinked, realizing she'd been heard. Then she turned away, smoothing her dress, pretending to laugh again. But the sound didn't reach her eyes. Behind her, the band changed tempo, a slow guitar riff that echoed in the background. I took a slow breath and felt gravity return to my feet. The moment had come. I had evidence. Memory. The clarity I'd been waiting for bottled in that water story. The water she thought was a joke or a twist of fate, but wasn't. I finished my glass of water, placed it gently on the stand, and stepped back toward the table. Everything leading up to this had been forging me every accusation, every sideline, every silent judgment. Now it had come full circle. And in that silence I carried with me, I found my next move. After I was cleared, they transferred me to a lesser-known unit, deep in logistics, far from field operations, far from visibility. It was a quiet corner of the military, where promotions rarely came and recognition even less so. On paper, it looked like a demotion. In practice, it was a chance. I threw myself into every task. Whatever the mission, I volunteered. When they needed someone to untangle supply chains in remote bases, I took it. I learned double the protocols, the paperwork, the back channels that ensured trucks rolled supplies arrived and units stayed fed. I pored over maps at night, memorized air routes, middleware logistics. My peers whispered behind me, "She's making herself indispensable," though none dared say it aloud. Then came the turning point. A request for volunteers reached our unit, a foreign corridor, collapsed units stranded behind rebel lines. The call said danger, and I answered. They sent me in with a small team, 2 medics, a communications specialist, and me. Our objective: hold the line, organize evacuation, keep morale alive until further support arrived. Under fire, I gave orders, clear, concise, then walked the perimeter, checked the wounded, moved with purpose even when mortars screamed overhead. Downloads of gratitude came later, personal messages from soldiers saying I kept them afloat. Commanders noted how calmly I navigated chaos. I didn't talk about it when I got home. I unpacked gear in my quarters, washed sweat off my face and went to bed. No celebration. Just another day. Months later, a full-scale extraction was planned. Enemy fighters flanked our supply route. They pinned half a battalion. I was asked to take command on the ground. In a haze of dust and flash of tracers, I reorganized the fallback orchestrated vehicles through blocked passes, coordinated helicopter lifts, and by dawn, every one of our people was out wounded, weary, but alive. I stood on that rubble and listened to the chopper blades fade, and I thought, they needed me. They needed a leader who wouldn't flinch. Word reached headquarters. My transfer report landed on someone's desk and stayed there until Colonel Callahan, my former commanding officer, read it. He tracked me down after the fact. He said quietly, "You did well, Quinn. We need more officers like you." I didn't seek recognition, but I didn't hide from it either. His praise wasn't about medals, it was about trust. He endorsed me for promotion, wrote letters, backed me. Within months, I was nominated for Major General. And just like that, the soldier who'd been exiled to obscurity was fast-tracked to the rank they said she didn't deserve. No parades, no headlines, just paperwork, the quiet signing of orders, the transfer of stars to my collar. Security clearance kept the stories under wraps, but the impact rippled through command channels. A woman who'd been called a quitter was now among the top 50 most senior officers in her branch. I spent the next few months living in schedules, meetings about logistics, reforms, strategy briefings, visits to deployed units. Even there, I stayed low. I didn't brag. Why would I? Everything I did had led here. Everything I survived. I was exactly where I needed to be. I was still me, Maya Quinn, though not the one they thought they knew. My hand still shook. My team's hand still reviewed reports, long into the night, still asked questions others didn't think to ask. I was not the quiet failure they assumed. I was a general. And more than that, I was someone who proved, without speaking, that silence was not surrender. That was the climb, slow, steady, forged in shadows. And in the high command halls, where decisions shaped deployments, I was quietly, undeniably present. When a final exam for promotion was required, it wasn't a test of bone density or toughness. It was a test of character. I didn't write an essay about injustice or neglect. I wrote about results, about chain of command, about lives saved. My file landed in front of the review board. One by one, they signed off. I wore the uniform quietly. Then, one morning, I woke up and I had the stars. Colonel Callahan was there, unannounced, unofficial, in the mess hall when it happened. He nodded at me. No fanfare, no photo ops. He slid into the seat across from me, said simply, "Congratulations, General Quinn." I nodded back a soft smile because everyone else in that room, the ones who hadn't seen me for decades, were yet to learn. But commanders across theatres already knew, and that mattered more than anything. I've done more since strategic deployments, alliance, coordination, humanitarian missions. My name isn't splashed across newspapers, isn't trending on social. But in the internal networks, my calls and plans ripple outward. I'm still here, still climbing, still proving. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving me right. And as I sit here, in that same quiet confidence, I remember why I climbed to reclaim space I earned, and to remind anyone who still questions, they're wrong. What's next in this journey is where the story truly breaks open. I was halfway through my glass of champagne when Rachel and Judith, two familiar faces I'd hoped to avoid, made their approach. They've always been inseparable at family events, like polished twins in heels and forced smiles. Rachel, blonde hair, curled, just so offered her concerned version of a greeting. "Maya darling, still serving. That must be tough on your knees at 50. Her voice had that condescending lilt, like she was lecturing an underling not speaking to a major general. Judith, with her silver-rimmed glasses and tight blazer, chimed in, "Or is it more about avoiding other things, family, kids?" She arched an eyebrow so perfectly it was almost surgical. They smiled, but their eyes held something colder, something that said, "We're doing you a favour by speaking at all." I could practically feel the judgment radiating off them. Their words were coated in concern, but underneath they sliced one line suggesting my age, and service signalled obsolescence. The next, implying my single status, was a character flaw. Both veiled in politeness, both meant to wound. As they prattled on, I noticed the soft buzz of the room, the background chatter, the clinking of glasses fade into quiet. My focus narrowed. I caught the way a waiter paused nearby, uncertain whether to pass the champagne. I felt my heart calm, then steady, as if I were centering on a target. I decided not to interrupt. I didn't correct them, didn't launch into details about deployments or logistics chains or covert negotiations. That wasn't my purpose. Instead, I held my champagne flute lightly, letting the bubbles rise as I let the hours of training and service fill my posture. I listened to the underlying whispers behind their words. They meant to reduce me, quiet, small, irrelevant. When Rachel finished tilting her head as if waiting for gratitude, I set my glass down firmly. I looked from Rachel to Judith and spoke. The people I served. They're still alive. My voice was measured steady, no need for raising it. Sincerity did the heavy lifting. Her jaw went slack. Judith's cheeks coloured ever so faintly. "But don't worry, I don't expect either of you to get it." I paused, letting the honesty settle. And that's okay. There was no flash of a triumphant smile, no victory dance inside. Just a deep breath and the satisfaction of standing in truth. Rachel paused, then said, "Well, that must be rewarding." Her tone lacked its earlier crispness. Judith stayed silent. I nodded once cool and fixed, then turned away. I let them watch my departure. I moved to the shadows near the band, using the music as my shield. I didn't dwell on their faces or rewind their words. I didn't need to. Inside, I thought, this is how it works. You don't rewrite the stories other people tell. You speak once, then live your life so that no further words are required. And in that breath, I realized it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about being seen correctly. It was about refusing the roles they assigned. I would keep moving forward in silence or with words, but always with purpose. And then the microphone shifted. Colonel Callahan. Elena's new father-in-law, a man respected for his calm authority, stepped forward. People expected the usual niceties, a thank you to guests, a nod to family, something light and polite. Instead, he paused, scanning the room as though he'd caught a familiar silhouette out of the corner of his eye. His gaze settled on me, seated at table 12. Moments earlier, he'd caught sight of me and leaned across to an old comrade at his table. Could that be General Quinn? He'd whispered. The nod he got in response sealed the intent behind his stride to the mic now. The buzz quieted as he opened his mouth. There's someone here tonight who saved my life in Afghanistan when we were pinned down under fire, he said. His voice was steady, even holding them in place. General Quinn. Ma'am. After that, he snapped into a flawless military salute. And everything froze. Time slowed. The clinking of glasses halted mid-toast. Eleanor, frozen centre stage, stared as though trying to process what she'd just heard. My mother's face went white as if she'd been hit with a bucket of cold water. The chatter in the room halted, replaced by stunned silence. I stayed seated. No gratitude, no tears, just a single crisp nod in acknowledgement. My hand tightened around the stem of my water glass, my anchor in that sudden maelstrom of attention. I didn't need to speak. His words spoke for both of us. The hush lasted maybe 15 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Then a ripple slithered through the crowd. One person stood the groom's college roommate, a retired sergeant who'd served with Callahan. He brought his hand to his head and saluted me. Others followed a group of veterans at the back. The wedding planner, even the catering manager, paused mid-step and dipped his head. I saw my sister blush, not anger or embarrassment, just shock. My mother put a hand to her throat, as if to catch her words, but found none. Eleanor's eyes filled with disbelief and for the first time realization. Callahan lowered his hand but kept his eyes on mine. That's all he said, voice unhurried. He allowed himself a small respectful nod before stepping back. The weight of his salute hung in the air unspoken, unapologetic, and then someone clapped. The first round of applause was hesitant, soft, respectful. Then another and another until the room roared. Genuine, warm, no longer staged. Some guests wiped tears. Some stood. Several veterans embraced one another, glancing at me with that faint smile that says, "Thank you." In that glow of acknowledgement, I felt something shift inside. I hadn't come for applause, but something more, the truth to be recognised. And here it was, shaking the hall. The MC coughed, clearing her throat. "Please, may we have General Quinn join us up front?" she said, voice a little unsteady. I rose, slowly aware of every head turning. The spotlight I never asked for had found me. Walking toward the front felt surreal. I heard extra gasps as I passed. I noticed a man whisper, "She's 48. No way. She looks 20 years younger." A woman's head shook incredulous. I didn't know. At the head table, Callahan offered me a seat. I sat beside him with purpose, not permission. A charged energy shifted the room. Realized I belonged here. Not as a forgotten guest, but as someone who shaped outcomes, who'd walked against tragedy and trauma and emerged stronger. People leaned in as I passed. I offered nods and half smiles, grateful but measured. I didn't need to explain or justify. The salute had said it all. As they resumed the toasts, the words carried differently. Warm congratulations, surprised acknowledgement, curiosity. Family members who'd ignored me before now asked about my service. A few neighbours hovered visibly uneasy of their previous assumptions. Even Eleanor's groom clapped me on the shoulder, murmuring, "Thank you, Ma'am." Truly. I glanced at my sister. She looked unfiltered, without expectation, more human. Her eyes held a glimmer of regret. Yes, but also the relief of finally seeing something real. My mother dabbed at her eyes, not with staged tears, but softly, as if she was grieving her own inability to know me until now. Then the music began again, lighter now, no longer background to the ceremony, but a celebration of visibility. And in that moment, I thought, this is why I came. Not for closure, not redemption, but for truth, to stand for a woman who'd been erased to become undeniable. In the crowd's applause, the gentle thrum of celebration, I found my place. Not in the tables, the seating plans, the family narratives, but in the space I'd chosen to occupy. A general who had been overlooked, finally acknowledged. It started subtly. A few older gentlemen men I'd never met, wearing the quiet pride of veterans, stood up first. Their posture shifted from polite attention to military firm. Hats came off hands, rose in salute. Shoulder to shoulder they lined up, eyes steady, expression solemn. Recognition spread. A nephew I barely remembered standing beside me, straightened at the waist, his salute precise. Then cousins old enough to blink back. Memories of childhood family dinners joined in. Even some of the bride's college friends, guys whose shirts I'd helped straighten at previous celebrations, stood saluting me with silent understanding. The room seemed to catch its breath. I met each salute with the same disciplined respect and not a chance for connection. Inside, my chest was heavy with emotions. I hadn't allowed myself relief, pride, release. After all the years of questioning, of erasure, of playing invisible there, it was vindication. Eleanor froze where she stood. Her eyes, wide with shock, carried a hurt I recognized surprise that bordered on shame. She opened her mouth, then closed it. My mother at the head table reacted more subtly. Her pale face flickered with consciousness of something broken in front of others. That same mix of recognition and regret flickered through our family's faces. One of the caterers paused, tray midair. A fork clattered to a cloth napkin, with a small thud too loud in that moment. All attention centered on me, not the bride, not the decor, but me seated at an unremarkable table that nobody thought to set with matching chairs or printed name cards. Whispers rippled. That's General Quinn. The General Quinn. She's a general. Some voices wavered with wonder, others with guilt. I realized they were asking themselves, why didn't I know? Or why didn't I see their questions spoke more about their assumptions than about me? I let the moment stretch. I didn't speak. I didn't stand. I simply allowed their recognition to land unfiltered. I sensed, no, I knew that for some of them this quiet acknowledgement was the first true recognition they'd ever offered me. In the pause, I thought back to my early days standing in a gyroscoped desert, hearing rounds pass overhead, commanding a platoon through sandstorms and power outages. I thought of uniforms crisp under flashing lights of nights spent planning evacuations of silent prayers for lives I couldn't save. None of that carried weight here until now, but in this moment, that past and this room collided, and it was enough. Then the last salute dropped. Music resumed quietly, but softer, more thoughtful. Conversations began again, quieter, full of reflection rather than chatter. Eleanor glided toward me, her heels clicking on the polished floor. I met her halfway, not to bridge the gap yet, but to show I was content standing in my ground. She opened her mouth probably to apologize or explain, but she closed it and instead reached out, hovering her fingertips near the back of my chair. She didn't touch me. I didn't lean away. My mother watched, her eyes filled with something I recognized, not fear, but loss. She swallowed hard and looked away. Perhaps she realized that loving me had once meant letting me prove myself. All this in the quiet aftermath of a salute spoke louder than any speech. I acknowledged Eleanor with a steady nod. I acknowledged Mom with a brief upward glance. That was all. I offered no forgiveness yet, but no retreat. In that moment, I understood acknowledgement doesn't heal wounds instantly, but it begins the work. I didn't ask for closure. I didn't need confrontation. I only needed recognition, and that quiet, powerful salute across a crowded room gave it. Sitting there, I finally felt whole, not because they saluted me, but because I was no longer hiding from their sight. I was visible on my own terms. The rest, family expectations, unspoken histories could wait. A few moments passed, and the atmosphere in the hall shifted. Guests who had stood frozen now hesitated, exchanged uncertain glances, then made their way toward me. First came Andrew, a cousin I barely knew, carrying a champagne flute. "Maya?" "General Quinn," he said, voice tight. I didn't know, I'm sorry." I nodded, accepting the apology, not verbally, but with a small quiet gesture of recognition. He let out a relieved breath that felt as much for him as it did for me. Then came Judith, the woman who once joked that I looked too fragile, too early retired, too delicate to stay. Her smile wavered as she placed a hand on my shoulder. "General, you've done us all proud," she whispered in a tone meant just for me. No excuse, no over-the-top flattery, just a simple acknowledgement. I met her gaze and nodded again. That nod carried far more weight than any words could have. More people followed, friends of Eleanor's, who paused mid-sentence at the head table. A few cousins with tears stained in the corners of their eyes. Even a groomsman adjusting his jacket, clearing his throat, offering something stiffly rehearsed in his apology. I accepted each with the same quiet grace, no triumph, no bitterness. I didn't need to pinpoint who had turned a blind eye or who made the assumptions. In that moment, I didn't need to. It was enough that they came forward. Then, a little girl, maybe 8 years old, approached. She tugged at my sleeve. "Are you a superhero?" she asked, eyes wide and earnest. I looked down at her, surprised, and something warm brushed against my chest. "No," I whispered, leaning slightly forward so she could hear. "I'm just someone who didn't leave." She considered, that nodded, then gave me a hug. Her small arms felt bigger than any crowd. The photographer who had overlooked our table earlier circled back. "May I get a photo?" she asked quietly. I turned and gave a simple, composed smile. "Sure," I said. She clicked several shots, just a headshot, a posed frame, a moment, in which I looked both strong and grounded. Afterwards, she whispered, "They'll want this." I didn't need to ask who they were. I'd already seen enough. As the reception buzz resumed around me, the energy wasn't awkward or forced, it was respectful. People stepped aside to let me through. Conversations included me rather than ignoring me. Eleanor's friends lingered, close eyes watching, hesitant to speak, but clearly interested. And even my own mother looked at me without turning away, an unspoken truce in her eyes. I leaned back in my chair, watched the ceremony continue from this new vantage point. I still didn't feel like I belonged in that world of bridesmaid bouquets or speeches about new beginnings. But I belonged as myself, neither hero nor victim, just Maya Quinn. That sufficed. Halfway through dessert, someone brought a small plate over and whispered, "Your table, may I share this with you?" I inclined my head, and 3 voices answered with soft laughter. We shared cake crumbs and polite conversation about work, none of it military, about travel, about random life things. But it felt important human. I introduced myself, just "Maya, no title please," and they smiled warmly, treating me like an equal at last. Before long, more than 6 guests had stopped by. Some lingered for a few minutes, some for a whole song, others to deliver handwritten notes of admiration. One woman, a distant cousin, brought a framed photo of my dad and me from when I was 6, jogging around the backyard in her town. "I couldn't find a place for this earlier," she said softly, placing it next to me. I caught her elbow. She squeezed my hand. I felt emotional, but not overwritten. Just gratitude steadying in my chest. A sense of reclamation washed over me. The chair that had once felt like an afterthought became the centre of connection. Table 12. that forgotten corner had become a hub of recognition. I realized the real fracture wasn't between strangers and me, it was between how I saw myself and how I allowed the world to define me. Watching these people lean in, whisper apologies, share their admiration, it wove a new possibility that I could choose where and how to show up. Time blurred. Music and laughter wove around me, but I stayed anchored in that chair. I had no speech prepared. None needed to be made. The moment was enough. I simply existed in full form, neither echo nor shadow. When the band started a second dance set, I left my seat slowly, deliberately. I walked past the head table and raised my glass toward Eleanor and her new husband. She returned my gaze. I didn't expect a smile from her, just recognition. That was enough. At the edge of the night, as I stepped outside for a breath of cool air, a few guests followed, asking more questions, inviting me to speak at their tables, promising they'd make the next event about me. I thanked them, gently declined. Part of me wanted to stay in this moment a little longer, but I knew my next move waited beyond the room. When I slipped into the night, I carried with me something I hadn't let myself have in years, the solid knowledge that being seen isn't weakness, it's power. Moments later, I found myself standing on the far side of the courtyard, under the glow of string lights, breathing in cool air. It was peaceful, almost serene, until footsteps approached behind me. I turned slowly. Mother stood there, her posture rigid, face pale under the lantern light. She cleared her throat, her voice quiet but firm. "Maya, don't make a scene. This isn't your event." Her words landed smooth, practiced. No raw emotion, just a boundary one she expected me to respect. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I searched her expression for something: guilt, regret, remorse, or even the familiar cold distance. What I saw was discomfort and fear. Her eyes flicked around, worried the wrong person might overhear. Finally, I spoke calm and soft. "Stability, who is it for Mother?" My words paused her. She blinked, pressed her lips together, then exhaled sharply. "For everyone. This is about Eleanor. It was her day, you know that." I nodded. The implication wasn't lost on me. Of course I knew. But I also knew something more: that apology without understanding is useless. Instead of confronting her, I simply tilted my head and turned away. I walked across the courtyard. My footsteps were deliberate. Behind me, I heard a quick intake of breath, Mother, moving, trying to close the distance. But I didn't stop. Eleanor emerged from the reception doors, then late the echo of laughter trailing after her. She froze when she saw me. Up close, I could see the conflict in her eyes. Relief, guilt, maybe even pride. She started forward, voice low. "Maya." I kept walking. She called again, voice a whisper, meant to break the moment. "Please, can we—" I stopped, turned in place, and just looked. No harshness, no reproach, just presence. She swallowed, changed tack, lips trembling. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Her voice cracked. Silence stretched. I stepped forward into a personal space, just enough to enter conversation, but not too much. "Don't," I said gently. "I'm fine." She didn't ask why. I didn't explain. We turned together toward the reception hall, each steps echoing in the night air. She tried again. I wanted you here." I stopped, looked at her. The expression in her eyes was honest, and it hurt in a way that made forgiveness possible, but not immediate. "I know," I said softly. "Thank you." I stepped past her and continued inside. She let me go. Back in the room, energy hummed, laughter, soft music, departure chatter. I walked calmly past now familiar guests. Some paused, offered nods or small gestures. I nodded back. I found my chair at the edge of the head table. I paused, looked at it, empty now, creased with my memory of earlier. That chair had borne witness, held me, shaped me. I sat down again. No tension, no defiance, just quiet belonging. Mother came up beside me, hesitated, then her voice floated over my shoulder. "Your flight home is early," I gave her a polite nod. "Yes." She didn't press. She didn't speak again. Elena stepped closer, hovering at arm's length. I looked at her and gave a small respectful nod. That was all. No tears, no speeches, just two women bound by blood standing in a room transformed by what had unfolded. Around us, guests began drifting away. Music slowed. The hall felt softer in this quiet hour. I stood, gathered my coat. Elena lingered. I said quietly, "We'll talk later." She nodded. Mother moved away. Elena followed her. I turned and left. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking. No one called after me. No one asked if I needed a ride. I didn't slow down. I'd said my piece, taken my seat, and then I left. The streets were quiet, the wedding lights dimming behind me, and I settled into the solitude. It felt good not to be seen for now, not by them. A few blocks down, I passed beneath a blinking street lamp and stopped. There, sitting on the curb near a corner store, was a man wrapped in a worn blanket. His face was weathered, his beard unkempt, and in his lap he held a cardboard sign with simple, sharp letters I served. No other words, just that. I studied him for a moment. He didn't look up. Pressed the blanket tighter around his shoulders. I didn't know why I stopped, but something pulled me closer. I knelt beside him and offered my hand palm open. He glanced up slowly, recognition in his eyes still there behind the lines of fatigue and pain. "I served too," I said softly. I handed him a 20 exact change for a coffee and a meal. His fingers curled around it, weak, hesitant. "Not all of us get uniforms that fit," I added, and he managed a small grin. The night held us there, a moment of shared service, of unspoken understanding. Walking away, I felt the weight in my chest shift. It was hope and outrage. The outrage that someone who gave everything could be left with nothing, and the hope that maybe I could help. I reached out my phone and typed notes under the streetlights. Veterans who served but are unseen. Family broken, no support, need a place, a voice. By the time I got home, I wasn't thinking about wedding chairs or family plates anymore. I was thinking about how to help him and others like him. In the days that followed, I tracked down resources, reached out to contacts I trusted from my years on classified missions. A non-profit here, a shelter there. I called volunteers. I sketched out plans to build a support group of veterans who had been ignored by families, by society. I believed that if people like me could be erased at a family event, we weren't alone. There had to be space to be seen again. It took time. Calls were returned slowly. Meetings were scheduled in community centres and VA lounges. But I pushed. I anchored the effort with my own story to show that just because someone out of uniform doesn't mean they don't exist. Then the letter came. "Dear General Quinn, I lost my home after returning from Iraq. I had no one. Your program helped me find a place to sleep and a job that pays enough for the first time in a year. You gave me a reason to stay. Thank you." I read that in my small office, the morning light filtering through blinds. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because finally, for the first time in a long time, I didn't need applause from them or anyone else. I had given someone a reason to be seen, and that was enough. The next day, I returned to that man under the street lamp. He looked up. I raised the letter, and he grinned the kind of grin that says, "You're one of us." As I walked away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because here, in this moment, home wasn't a place or a name on a card. Home was knowing I mattered, that others would matter too. I closed my eyes and breathed deep. I had been seen, and that was power. If you've ever been the one cropped out of the family photo, the name left off the guest list, the person sitting at a table no one meant to set. Just know this, you're not alone. There are people like you, like me, still quietly showing up. Not for applause, but because we know we deserve to take up space in this world. You don't have to be a general or save lives on a battlefield to be worthy. If you're still here, still getting up on days when no one sees you, still choosing kindness, in a world that forgets to look back, that alone makes you extraordinary. These days, people are learning to heal in different ways through therapy, journaling, mindfulness, or simply by finding small communities where they don't have to explain their past. You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to be real with yourself. And if you're starting from nothing, I want you to know there's no shame in that. If this story resonated with you, if you saw a part of yourself in Maya, stick around. Hit subscribe, not just to hear more stories like this, but to remind yourself someone gets it. Someone's been there too. And when you're ready to tell your story, even just a quiet sentence at a time, I hope you remember the world needs it. We need you.